This small tobacco tin could be easily overlooked, but it belonged to a World War I fighter pilot, Edward Barfoot Drake. We discovered that Drake has long been credited with shooting down the first enemy aircraft whose pilot survived by bailing out with a parachute. But when we examined the details closely, the claim weakened, and as it did, something more unsettling came into focus. Why were British airmen denied the very equipment that had just saved Drake's German adversary in a duel over France? In this episode of Along These Lines, we trace a young pilot's journey through the deadly world of the Royal Flying Corps, while also following the campaign of early parachute inventor Everard Calthrop as he takes on the establishment in a fight to introduce parachutes.
After 2 years' experimental work, I have succeeded in creating the Guardian Angel parachute.
Could Calthrop's invention come in time to save Drake and countless others from almost certain death?
They said it was not safe, as if diving to one's death in a burning aeroplane was safer.
Edward Drake belonged to the first generation of fighter pilots, young men learning to fly while the war was already underway. After turning 18, he decided to join the Royal Naval Air Service. On July 16, 1916, he was inducted as a sub-lieutenant at Crystal Palace in London. The vast exhibition centre had been repurposed as a major Royal Navy training depot. At that moment, the air war over the Somme in northern France was already raging. British pilots were flying constant patrols and artillery spotting missions, with thousands of sorties already flown in the opening weeks of the historic battle. It was during his time in London that this tin was acquired, as it bears the date of the 1st of August. Just 4 days later, he went up north to Redcar in Sheffield. He would have begun flying very primitive aircraft, such as the Farman MF-7, Blériot 11 and Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2. These are flimsy looking planes, to say the least. After only 2 months of training, he earned his pilot certificate, but instead of this being the end of his journey, it marked the point where the real danger began, flying operational missions in wartime. With a high mortality rate among trainees due to the rudimentary nature of aviation technology and the lack of standardised safety procedures, by the end of the conflict, around 1,600 were killed at training schools in the UK, Canada, Egypt and France. The Royal Flying Corps, the air arm of the British Army, became grimly known as the Suicide Club. As aviation advanced faster than safety or understanding, the risks only increased, and one man sought to change the fate awaiting so many young pilots. Everard Calthrop was a retired British railway engineer with an interest in aviation. He was close friends with Charles Rolls of Rolls-Royce fame. Rolls was a pioneer aviator, being the first man to fly across the English Channel in both directions. Calthrop's passion for creating a parachute came when he witnessed Rolls die in an accident after he lost control of his biplane at an international aviation meeting in Bournemouth. He also saw a close call where his son Tev almost died. By 1913, a year before war broke out, Calthrop had successfully patented and tested his design, a static line parachute. He called it the Guardian Angel, but it wasn't until October 1915 that it would officially be presented to the RFC. The enterprising superintendent of the Royal Air Factory, Mervyn O'Gorman, saw the potential for use in airplanes.
I fitted one to an aircraft for preliminary trials using a dummy.
So he wrote to the Directorate of Military Aeronautics, requesting approval for the small cost involved.
Do you wish experiments of this nature to proceed?
The Assistant Director noted. The reply from General Henderson, General Officer Commanding of the RFC, was blunt.
No, certainly not.
So why was there such a negative reply when life-saving equipment is suggested? At the time, the British military establishment was deeply conservative. Hugh Trenchard, officer commanding the military wing of the Royal Flying Corps, and later known as the father of the Royal Air Force, was described by an official war correspondent as Napoleon in this War of the Skies. intolerant of timidity, and not squeamish of heavy losses if the balance were tipped against the enemy. There was a real belief that if pilots were given an easy escape, they'd abandon their machines too quickly, rather than fight to the end or attempt to land. To some commanders, a parachute wasn't a tool of courage, it was an invitation to cowardice. Another obstacle was simple ignorance at the top. Airborne men who had never experienced air combat and whose understanding of warfare belonged to an earlier age. Even an officer as respected as Assistant Director of the Air Department, Robert Marsland Groves, could write,
"Smashed aircraft generally fall with such velocity that there would hardly be time to think about the parachute."
By 1916, the war on the Western Front had descended into a brutal stalemate. Battles such as Verdun and the Somme consumed entire armies on the ground. Above them, a new and deadly dimension of the war was taking shape in the skies, where losses mounted rapidly on both sides. As aircraft became faster and combat more intense, the question of how a pilot might survive being shot down became increasingly urgent. In Germany, the debate over parachutes was already underway. Senior officers shared much of the British scepticism, fearing they might encourage pilots to abandon their aircraft too readily. But the race to develop a practical design had begun. The Prussian War Ministry eventually commissioned former balloon pilot Cathay Paulus, an aerial acrobat and pioneering parachute inventor, to produce a compact pack parachute. Her design could be folded into a small case, and by mid-1916 she had been contracted to manufacture 7,000 of them. The British soon followed suit and sanctioned them for use in balloons only. Calthrop's parachute was not the design ultimately chosen. In fact, the parachute specifically developed for military balloon use had already been designed and tested as early as 1913, when Lieutenant Colonel Edward Maitland of the RNAS asked C.G. Spencer & Sons to create a parachute packed in a container that could be fixed directly to a balloon basket or airship gondola. The system was tested by Maitland himself in jumps from a British Army airship. Balloon observers had only seconds to escape, needing to clear the basket before the balloon collapsed onto it, and also avoid having the canopy inflate too quickly, since burning debris could ignite the silk, which may explain why some British observers distrusted designs like the Guardian Angel, whose canopy opened almost instantly. Calthrop, rather unfairly, found himself on the back foot. This newspaper clip, dated December 1915, talks of his hurried response to public confusion following Lieutenant Colonel Maitland's dramatic descent, in which the parachute did not open immediately. Amid rumours that the failed device was one of his own, Calthrop was quick to defend the reputation of his Guardian Angel.
As Lieutenant Colonel Maitland's daring fall has deservedly attracted great attention, and as the impression that it was one of my parachutes which failed to open seems to be widespread, and is likely, if uncontradicted, to seriously impair the reputation of my invention, I should like to say that the parachute in which Lieutenant Colonel Maitland made his descent was not one of mine. After nearly 2 years' experimental work, I have succeeded in creating the Guardian Angel parachute, which has never failed to open instantaneously and automatically in all the numerous private and official tests that have been made of it.
Whilst the debate continued, young Edward honed his skills at Cranwell in Lincolnshire. Here, it was noted that he had become a fair pilot on all planes except Scouts. Scouts would have been the Sopwith range of planes. They were harder to fly than many other World War I aircraft because of several design factors that made it challenging for inexperienced pilots. The engine, fuel, guns and pilot were all positioned close together near the front. It made the Camel highly manoeuvrable but also unstable, meaning pilots had to constantly make corrections to keep it flying level. Lieutenant Elliot W. Springs was an experienced American pilot. He described the Camel as
a tricky little biplane. They would do about 90 miles per hour level, but you couldn't fly level because they would shake your teeth out in 40 seconds by the clock. You had to climb or glide. but they could fly upside down and turn inside a stairwell. They would stall at 15,000 feet and lose 1,000 feet in a turn. But they were deadly below 5,000 feet if you could suck the Fokkers down to that level.
It was clear that even experienced pilots would struggle to survive in these machines. The war had entered its third year, and neither side appeared to have the upper hand. On January 13th, as men in the trenches fought the cold and pilots battled for control of the skies above France, New Zealand pilot Captain Clive Franklin Collett was posted to the Royal Flying Corps' experimental station at Orfordness, Suffolk, to test a parachute designed by Everard Calthrop. He successfully jumped from a Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C from a height of 600 feet. He repeated the experiment several days later. There was no doubt that the parachute worked, but RFC leaders continued to refuse to approve parachutes for pilots. For the aircraft they were fitted to, it was thought that they reduced speed and climb rate, and the weapon and fuel load among them. Also, each type had to be looked at individually, as the pilot and observer would need a clear exit and not have problems with wires or aircraft structure. Wing Commander Archibald James gives more detail to the decision.
The development of parachutes was in its infancy, and the only available parachutes were so cumbersome and big that there simply wasn't room for them in the cockpit. The harness would have affected the efficiency and mobility of the personnel in the aircraft. They'd have been jammed into their seats. It simply wasn't practical to have them.
Another member of the Air Board, Lord Sydenham, wasn't sure if pilots had the required reflex skills. He wrote,
"The point is, could pilots make use of the Guardian Angel parachute at the moment when it becomes clear that their machine had come to grief?"
Calthrop also had heard the argument that issuing parachutes would weaken pilots, that in trouble they'd panic, jump too soon, and crash more machines. He disagreed, insisting the opposite was true.
A pilot who knew he had a last resort would fly more boldly and attempt more.
His plea fell on deaf ears. He was even pressured to keep his invention quiet, with the Air Board not wanting to upset the public. May 1917 was a moment of crisis. The Allies had just fought the Battle of Arras, producing the largest Allied advance since trench warfare began. But it ultimately failed to achieve a breakthrough. This battle is also famous for Bloody April, when the Royal Flying Corps suffered devastating aircraft losses supporting the offensive. In light of this, Calthrop made another desperate plea. He suggested that if his parachutes could not be used by squadrons in France, they might at least be employed in training schools. General Lionel Charlton's decision in the column of the minute sheet was simply
No.
Calthrop persisted, arguing that men were dying needlessly.
What about in view of the many deaths from the burning of pilots?
Not many.
Commented Charlton. But the figures tell a very different story. Later statistics examining pilot losses between 1914 and 1918 revealed that around 30% of aircraft were seen to flame in mid-air, suggesting Charlton's dismissal was either poorly informed or dangerously understated. In the summer of 1917, after so many attempts, Calthrop had nothing to lose. He defied the request to be quiet and went public with his invention by placing advertisements and articles in the aeronautical press promoting his Guardian Angel parachute. It led to a committee to rule on the use of parachutes, and they came to this conclusion.
It is the opinion of the board that the presence of such an apparatus might impair the fighting spirit of pilots and cause them to abandon machines which might otherwise be capable of returning to base for repair.
Arthur Gould Lee was a fighter pilot who went on to become Air Vice Marshal during World War II. He documented his World War I service in a book titled No Parachute. He made his frustration clear.
Why, demanded press and public, if balloonists could escape death by parachute, could not the crews of heavier-than-air aircraft? The primary answer of RFC headquarters was that no parachute suitable for aeroplanes existed. Even if this were true, any kind of parachute could have been developed rapidly under the spur of war, just as the primitive aircraft of 1914 had swiftly advanced in performance under this spur.
Let's return to the owner of our tin. By June 1917, Edward had gained experience at various airfields, completing a course in seaplanes. He was now based at Manston on the Kent coast, one of the key locations in Britain's aerial defence network. The German Air Force had been bombing targets in London and Kent, aiming to disrupt military installations and civilian morale. On August 22, 1917, the German Air Force launched a daylight bombing raid over southeastern England, using 10 Gotha bombers. These twin-engine aircraft were part of Cagoule 3, the England Squadron, a unit specialising in strategic bombing missions against the United Kingdom. Edward had now earned the trust to fly the Sopwith Camel. He was ordered to engage the enemy aircraft. He dove on one of the retreating bombers between Herne Bay and Canterbury, then again over Deal and Dover, closing in as the enemy's machine guns fell silent, jammed. Flames erupted from the stricken bomber as it finally gave way, tumbling toward the channel below. For his courage and determination that day, Edward was mentioned in dispatches, commended for gallantry in attacking hostile machines during a raid on England. It was his first confirmed victory, and a sign of the kind of pilot he was becoming. Edward not only cut the enemy's strength, but also sent a powerful message to the attackers. The raid on August 22nd was the last daylight attack on England. These losses against Britain's improving defences resulted in the Gothas of Cagoule 3 abandoning daylight raids and changing to night bombing. As Drake was fighting over England, Calthrop pushed on with the publicising of his invention. The final and most spectacular demonstration of the Guardian Angel's speed of opening was made in November 1917, as British and German forces clashed at Cambrai on the Western Front. Back in England, Major Thomas Ord Rees made a daring jump from the upper walkway of London's famous Tower Bridge. The drop available was just 140 feet, but the parachute was fully deployed before its user plunged into the Thames. Still, no orders for parachutes in France ensued. By the beginning of 1918, the war had reached a decisive moment. Russia had collapsed, freeing German armies from a major push in the west. But with American troops beginning to arrive in growing numbers, Germany knew its opportunity would not last long, and prepared a massive offensive for the spring. Aircraft were now playing an increasingly vital role on the battlefield, and skilled pilots like Edward were urgently needed at the front. At the end of 1917, Edward had been recommended for promotion, said to be a very good pilot of all planes, hard-working with ability to command. So he was sent to Dunkirk, France, for action on the front lines. On April 1st, 1918, following the formation of the Royal Air Force, through the merger of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service, Drake joined the newly designated 209 Squadron RAF. This unit would be responsible for the downing of the world's most legendary pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, otherwise known as the Red Baron. The narrative of his final flight often centres on Captain Roy Brown and the Australian ground gunner, but it was truly a group effort by 209 Squadron's flight working in concert. We won't go into huge detail into this famous battle that's been told many times, but this is where Edward fits into the story. 209 Squadron flew in 3 flights that day. A flight flew highest, led by Captain Roy Brown. Their job was to control the sky, to strike first and from above. Below them, B flight had already engaged. They attacked a German 2-seater and sent it down in flames. That single encounter drew enemy fighters into the air and turned a routine patrol into a full-scale dogfight. C flight followed in support, among them Lieutenant Edward Barfoot Drake. Their role was to reinforce the fight, cover the squadron mates, and respond as the battle shifted. It was dangerous, chaotic work, often carried out at low altitude with little room for error. As the sky filled with twisting aircraft and gunfire, the fight broke apart into scattered duels. Pilots dived, climbed, and vanished into cloud and smoke. And the rest is history. Whilst this famous air battle led to the downing of the Red Baron, Edward, and quite possibly this tobacco tin, were there to bear witness. But this wasn't the moment Edward would be remembered for. We'll come back to that later on. As pilots from both sides were being lost at an alarming rate, Everard Calthrop wasn't the only designer working on saving lives. At the beginning of 1918, the German Air Force was ready to sanction the use of the parachute design by Otto Heinecke. He had been a ground crewman in a German army balloon unit. The parachute featured a silk canopy about 21 feet in diameter. The entire rig weighed roughly 5 kilos, a remarkable reduction from earlier parachutes that weighed between 30 and 45 kilos. This lightweight design was achieved in part by using the parachute pack itself as the pilot's seat or back cushion in the cockpit. The parachute was static line operated. One end of a webbing line was attached to the airplane and the other to the pack's ripcord. If a pilot had to jump, the falling weight of his body would pull the parachute free of the pack via the static line, deploying the canopy automatically. In practice, this was tricky. The pilot often had to stand or climb out of the cockpit before jumping, because many flew with the packed chute under them rather than strapped on fully during flight. This made escape difficult in a spinning or nosediving plane. Many German pilots were initially skeptical of the parachute's reliability, and with some reason. Of the first 70 airmen to bail out with Heinecke parachutes, about 1/3 died due to malfunctions. Despite the risks, the prospect of escaping a fiery death was enough to persuade many aviators to give the new device a chance. Back in London, the debates continued at the highest levels. General Trenchard had also pushed back Calthrop's design, but there was one exception. The chance to drop spies behind enemy lines was too valuable to ignore. In early 1918, he ordered 20 of Calthrop's Guardian Angel parachutes for intelligence work. In Italy, Major John Carter helped coordinate these secret operations. Agents were tasked with being flown over the front and getting dropped into enemy territory under cover of darkness, gathering vital information and organising sabotage missions. These are his own pictures and unclassified reports on the test flights.
The bolts were released and worked well, Captain Bowen falling in the aerodrome. In some unaccountable way, the parachute body was torn on leaving the machine. Also, the rope attached to the parachute got between Captain Bowen's legs and caused him to turn 2 somersaults before the parachute opened. Otherwise, the descent was satisfactory and Bowen landed safely.
But now their testing was over and their mission was set.
A man was produced from the 8th Italian Army Corps, a lieutenant of Arditi, the elite Italian assault troops, a tiny man and absolutely without fear. The night for the attempt was pitch dark, and arrangements had to be made for lighthouses and signals on the way. Captain William Barker piloted the machine. Barker has killed 35 Huns. At 1,200 feet east of Vittorio, in the vicinity of Saroni, they let the parachute go. Barker saw the parachute open out beautifully, and there seems little doubt that the descent was made successfully. The return journey, in spite of the inky darkness and attempts of the enemy to fix them with searchlights, was made in safety.
Trenchard's sanctioning for this use was an admission that the Guardian Angel worked, but the chance to save the lives of pilots was still not on the agenda. However, in Britain, public unrest was pushing politicians to make progress on the matter of parachutes. On June 13, 1918, as the German spring offensive tore across the Western Front, MP Philip Morel, a liberal pacifist, pressed the government on the urgent need for parachutes. Confronting the Under-Secretary of State for the Air Ministry, Major James Baird.
Are you aware of the loss of life among officers undergoing flying instruction? And that in 1917, nearly 800 pilots lost their lives on training grounds in Britain alone. Are you of the opinion of many competent men, a large proportion of these accidents might have been prevented if the use of parachutes had been allowed, and that a type of parachute suitable for this purpose has now been perfected?
Baird replies,
The great majority of accidents occur in circumstances in which it could not be hoped that any kind of parachute would be of avail.
By the summer of 1918, Edward had matured into an experienced pilot. Promoted to captain and flying in his Sopwith Camel, he had shot down 5 planes, becoming a fighter ace in the process. And on the evening of June 27, 1918, he found himself in yet another fierce dogfight. A duel that would supposedly etch both his name and his opponent's into the history books. Around 8:10 in the evening, near Wörthersee in Belgium, Edward engaged a German Pfalz scout from Jasta 46. Diving out of the sun, he closed in fast and fired, riddling the enemy fuselage until a lucky burst ignited the fuel tank. The German plane was ablaze as it staggered back towards German lines. Unlike his British counterparts, the pilot, Helmut Steinbrecher, had been issued a parachute, Otto Heineke's design. So when he realised the plane wouldn't make it, he bailed out. For Edward, it was another hard-won victory, but also a shocking glimpse at the safety measures denied to so many of his own comrades. In Helmut Steinbrecher's combat report, he wrote,
"Up to that time I had been a doubting Thomas in the matter of parachutes. I had been under the impression that bailing out with a parachute from a single-seater would be only rarely successful, and I did not know exactly what I had to do to get out of the plane. But in the moment when the flames licked my face, I did know at once what to do."
This story, reported by the Times newspaper, was the first time that the British public would hear that German pilots had the chance of surviving as their plane went down. A lot of records still state that Helmut Steinbrecher was the first pilot to successfully jump and survive, and Edward was the pilot who shot him down. But that simply isn't the case. 3 months earlier, on April 1st, Vice Sergeant Weimar jumped clear of his stricken Albatros DVA. So Weimar was the first man to successfully survive a parachute jump. When the Times newspaper published the story of Steinbrecher's survival in June, British papers such as the Daily Mail, Daily Mirror and regional journals printed letters from readers calling for parachutes. These often cited the unfairness that our lads had no means of escape. Arthur Gould Lee was flabbergasted at the rejection of Calthrop's design.
They said it was not safe, as if diving to one's death in a burning aeroplane was safer.
Major Mick Mannock, Britain's most famous flying ace of the war, was also angry at the lack of safety measures. Instead of carrying parachutes, RFC pilots carried revolvers. Mannock explained why.
To finish myself, as soon as I see the first signs of flames.
This media attention applied more pressure onto the airboard. It was recorded that on October 30th, 1918, MP Philip Morel asked more questions of Major Baird.
What progress has been made in the proposed application of parachutes to aeroplanes, and whether any will be allotted to training machines in this country?
This time he would finally receive the answer he was looking for. Major James Baird replied,
Sufficient progress with experimental parachutes for use for aeroplanes has been made to justify their provision for certain types of machines. The policy is to provide them first for machines in use in France.
A request for 500 of Calthrop's parachutes was submitted. Except for one minor modification, they were exactly the same as the models standardised in July 1916. 11 days after Morel and Baird's exchange in Parliament, the war ended. Perhaps if Vice Sergeant Weimar's jump was first reported in the Times in April, Edward may have been issued a parachute before he took off on his final flight. Just 6 weeks before the end of the war, on September 29, 1918, Edward took off in his Sopwith Camel on a patrol near Cambrai. His plane was hit by ground fire and went down behind enemy lines. At first, his squadron hoped he might have survived, perhaps taken prisoner. But as the days turned to weeks, hope faded. He has no known grave, but his name is carved into the Arras Flying Services Memorial in France. as well as the war memorial in his hometown of Goodwick. He was just 20 years old. Arthur Gould Lee talks about his extensive research into the reasons for parachutes being withheld. He came to the conclusion that
no one man, nor even any specific group of men, can in fairness be indicted. It was the collective official mind, actuated by intangible prejudice, which was responsible.
Except to drop off a handful of Italian spies into enemy territory, the British Air Force never used the Guardian Angel parachute during the war. Calthrop sums up his frustration in 1919.
No one in high quarters had any time to devote to investigating the merits of an appliance whose purpose was so ridiculously irrelevant to war as the saving of life in the air.
If you've watched up to this point, thank you very much. A lot of work went into this one, so thanks for sticking with it to the end. We looked high and low for more information on Edward. If you do have any letters or diaries bearing his name, we'd love to hear about them. We're still a small channel, and your support genuinely helps us tell more stories that might otherwise be forgotten. So please do give us a like and subscribe, and why not share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thanks again, and see you on the next one.